Samuel Yoder, a 50-year-old Amish carpenter in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, has been faithfully waiting 4 years for his intended bride, Sarah Miller, who moved to Ohio to care for her ailing mother. Just as Samuel receives word that Sarah is finally returning, he discovers 4 orphaned English children: Emma, 12, Jacob, 10, Luke, 8, and little Mercy, 6, hiding in his barn after escaping from an abusive foster home. What begins as temporary shelter becomes a divine calling that will test Samuel's faith, challenge his community's traditions, and ultimately reveal that sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as our most difficult choices. The morning mist clung to Samuel Yoder's weathered hands as he ran them along the smooth oak beam, checking for imperfections that existed only in his meticulous mind. At 50 years old, his calloused fingers could detect the slightest flaw in wood grain, a skill honed through 3 decades of crafting furniture that would outlast generations. His workshop stood silent except for the rhythmic scraping of his plane against the timber, each stroke deliberate and precise, like everything else in his carefully ordered life. Samuel paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief his late mother had sewn 20 years ago. The familiar ache in his chest returned, that hollow feeling that had taken residence 4 years ago when Sarah Miller climbed aboard the bus to Ohio, promising to return once her mother recovered. 4 years of letters that grew shorter with each passing season. 4 years of explanations about setbacks and complications. 4 years of Samuel maintaining faith while his community whispered about the Englisher ways creeping into their sacred traditions. Samuel? The voice of his neighbor Eli Stoltzfus carried across the yard. Samuel looked up to see the portly man hurrying toward the workshop, his black hat slightly askew, which meant news, either very good or very bad. Eli never rushed, unless circumstances demanded it. "Was ist los, Eli?" Samuel asked, setting down his plane and brushing wood shavings from his leather apron. Eli's round face was flushed from exertion, but his eyes sparkled with excitement. A letter came through Miller's store, from Sarah herself. The English Postal Service forwarded it express. "Samuel, she's coming home." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, though whether from joy or shock, he couldn't tell. His hands trembled slightly as Eli pressed the cream-colored envelope into his palm. Sarah's delicate handwriting spelled out his name in flowing script, the same penmanship that had filled dozens of letters over their years of separation. "When?" Samuel's voice came out rougher than intended. "Read it, man. Don't keep an old friend in suspense." Eli bounced on his heels like an excited child. Samuel carefully opened the envelope, his large fingers surprisingly gentle with the delicate paper. His eyes moved across Sarah's familiar script, absorbing each word with growing amazement. Her mother had finally passed peacefully. The estate was settled. She would arrive on the Thursday bus just 5 days away. After 4 long years, Sarah Miller was finally coming home to become Sarah Yoder. "She's coming Thursday," Samuel said quietly, the reality still sinking in. "Thursday. Gott sei Dank." Eli clapped Samuel's shoulder with enough force to make him stumble. "You must have so much to prepare. The house, the wedding arrangements." "The house is ready," Samuel interrupted softly. "It's been ready for 4 years. This was true. Every evening after work, Samuel had spent time preparing the modest 2-bedroom home his father had built decades ago. He'd refinished the floors, painted every wall, repaired every loose board. The quilts his sister Rebecca had made for their future marriage chest lay folded in tissue paper, waiting. Even the small garden plot behind the house had been maintained, planted each spring with vegetables Sarah had mentioned loving in her letters. Eli studied his friend's face, noting the mixture of joy and something else, uncertainty, perhaps. "You should be dancing, Samuel. Instead, you look like a man facing the gallows." Samuel managed a smile. "It's overwhelming is all. 4 years is a long time to wait for anything, but worth the wait, surely. Sarah Miller is a fine woman. Strong faith, good with children, excellent cook. Your patience will be rewarded. Ja, Samuel nodded, though something stirred uneasily in his chest. God's timing is perfect. After Eli left, Samuel tried to return to his work, but concentration proved impossible. His mind wandered to the last time he'd seen Sarah, a slender woman of 32 with serious brown eyes and a quiet demeanor. They'd courted for 2 years before her mother's illness called her away. Their relationship built on mutual respect and shared faith rather than passionate romance. It was the Amish way, the practical way, the godly way. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Samuel finally abandoned his workshop and walked to his house. The 2-bedroom structure felt impossibly quiet, as it had every day for the past 4 years. He moved through rooms that had been prepared for a wife who never came, touching furniture that had never known a woman's presence beyond his sister's occasional visits. In the kitchen, Samuel opened the cabinet where he kept Sarah's letters, 43 letters over 4 years, each one carefully preserved and chronologically arranged. He pulled out the most recent one, dated just 3 weeks ago, and reread it for the dozenth time. Her words were kind but distant, filled with updates about her mother's condition and memories of their shared past, but lacking any warmth that might suggest romantic longing. It read more like correspondence between old friends than letters between intended spouses. Had he been fooling himself these 4 years? Had his faithful waiting been merely stubborn pride, masquerading as devotion? Samuel was still pondering this question when he heard something that made his blood freeze, a child's cry, high and frightened, coming from somewhere outside. He'd lived alone long enough to recognize every normal sound of his property. This wasn't normal. Moving to the kitchen window, Samuel peered into the growing dusk. His barn stood 30 yards away, its familiar silhouette unchanged. But something was different. A faint light flickered through gaps in the wooden siding. Not the steady glow of his own lanterns, but the wavering light of a small flame, like a candle or match. Another cry reached his ears, followed by urgent whispers. Samuel's protective instincts, dormant for years, suddenly blazed to life. Someone was in his barn, and that someone sounded very young and very scared. Samuel grabbed his heaviest flashlight and stepped into the cool evening air. Each footstep seemed unnaturally loud as he approached the barn, his mind racing through possibilities. Lost travelers, runaway English children. His Amish community had dealt with such situations before, English youngsters fleeing troubled homes, drawn by romanticized notions of Amish simplicity. The barn door stood slightly ajar. Samuel could see the flickering light more clearly now, accompanied by the soft sounds of children's voices trying to whisper, but failing in the way only children could fail. He counted at least 3 distinct voices, maybe 4. "Hello," Samuel called softly, not wanting to frighten whoever was inside. "I am Samuel Yoder. This is my barn. Are you hurt?" The whispers stopped instantly. The light disappeared. Samuel waited in the sudden silence, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar mixture of concern and something else, something that felt almost like excitement. "I won't hurt you," he continued, his voice gentle, "but I need to know if you're safe. Are there adults with you?" A long pause, then a young voice, a girl Samuel thought, called out hesitantly, "We're not stealing anything, mister. We just needed somewhere to sleep." Samuel stepped closer to the door. "How many of you are there?" Another pause, filled with frantic whispering, then the same young voice, "4. We're 4. Samuel's chest tightened. 4 children, alone, seeking shelter in his barn. The practical Amish part of his mind immediately began calculating food requirements, sleeping arrangements, contact with proper authorities, but another part, a part that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten it existed, simply ached for these unknown children who had nowhere else to go. "May I come in?" Samuel asked. "I have a flashlight, and I'm not dangerous. I'm Amish." "Do you know what that means?" More whispering than a different voice. Younger, definitely a little girl. "Emma, I'm scared. My tummy hurts." I know what Amish means, came the first voice. Presumably Emma. You're like those people in the movies, with the horses and the bonnets. Something like that, Samuel smiled, despite his concern. May I come in? I'd like to help you. A long moment passed. Then, okay, but don't call the police yet. Please. Yet, suggested they knew the police would eventually be called, which meant these children were either lost or running from something. Samuel pushed open the barn door and stepped inside, his flashlight beam immediately revealing a sight that would be burned into his memory forever. 4 children huddled together in the far corner of the barn, illuminated by a single votive candle someone had somehow managed to light. The oldest was a girl of perhaps 12, with long dark hair and eyes that looked far too old for her face. She had her arms wrapped protectively around 3 younger children, 2 boys and a little girl who couldn't have been older than 6. They were dirty, obviously hungry, and wearing clothes that had once been nice but now bore the stains and wrinkles of desperate travel. But what struck Samuel most forcefully wasn't their physical condition, it was the way they clung to each other, 4 souls bound together by circumstances he could only imagine. Mein Gott, Samuel whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. The oldest girl, Emma, lifted her chin defiantly, despite the fear in her eyes. We haven't hurt anything. We were just going to sleep here tonight and then move on tomorrow. We didn't think anyone would mind. What are your names? Samuel asked gently, crouching down to make himself less intimidating. Emma hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I'm Emma. This is Jacob. He's 10. Luke is 8. And this is Mercy. She's 6. 4 children, 4 souls who had somehow found their way to his barn on the very day he'd learned Sarah was finally coming home. Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, like puzzle pieces clicking into place in a design he couldn't yet see. Where are your parents? He asked. Emma's jaw tightened. Dead, both of them. Car accident 3 months ago. And you've been alone since then? No. Emma's voice turned bitter. We were in foster care. The Hendersons. But Mr. Henderson, she trailed off, instinctively pulling her siblings closer. Samuel didn't need her to finish. The fear in her eyes, the protective way she held the others, the fact that they were running, it all painted a picture he'd rather not contemplate. His hands clenched involuntarily. You ran away, he said, not making it a question. 3 days ago. Emma confirmed. We've been walking mostly, hiding during the day, moving at night. We saw your farm and thought maybe we could rest here before moving on. Moving on to where? Emma's confidence faltered. We somewhere safe. Somewhere they won't find us. Samuel looked at the 4 faces staring back at him. Emma trying to be brave, Jacob attempting to mirror his sister's strength, Luke fighting tears, and little Mercy, who had given up fighting anything and simply looked exhausted. 4 children who had lost everything and were now trusting a strange Amish man with their secrets. Have you eaten today? Samuel asked. Emma shook her head reluctantly. Yesterday? Another shake, this one more hesitant. Samuel stood, his decision made. Come with me to the house. All of you, you need food and proper beds. We can't, Emma began. You can and you will, Samuel said firmly but kindly. I don't know what happened to you, but I know God doesn't send children to my barn without good reason. Come. As the 4 children slowly stood, clutching each other and their few possessions, Samuel felt his carefully ordered world tilting on its axis. Sarah was coming home in 5 days. His 4-year wait was finally ending. His life was supposed to return to the path he'd mapped out so carefully. But as he led these lost souls toward his house, Samuel began to suspect that God had very different plans that would challenge everything he thought he knew about faith, family, and the true meaning of answered prayers. The chapter ends here with Samuel leading the 4 children toward his house, unaware that this moment would change not just their lives, but transform his understanding of what it truly means to be called by God, to love unconditionally. Samuel's kitchen had never felt smaller. 4 pairs of eyes watched his every movement as he bustled around the modest space, pulling ingredients from cabinets that had been stocked for 1 but would now need to feed 5. The children sat clustered around his simple wooden table like refugees, which, Samuel realized with a pang, was exactly what they were. "I have bread," Samuel announced, his voice unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "And butter. Some ham from yesterday. Milk that's still fresh." He paused, glancing at their hollow faces. "When did you last have a real meal?" Emma, still acting as spokesperson for her makeshift family, swallowed hard before answering. "Sunday. The church we passed gave us sandwiches after their service. The people were nice, but they started asking too many questions, so we had to leave." Sunday, Samuel counted backwards. That was 4 days ago. 4 days these children had been surviving on whatever scraps they could find, walking God knew how many miles, sleeping wherever they could hide. His chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Well then," Samuel said, rolling up his sleeves, "we'll fix that right now." As he moved around the kitchen, Samuel became acutely aware of how the children tracked his every gesture. They weren't just hungry. They were terrified, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Emma kept one hand on little Mercy's shoulder and the other near what looked like a small backpack, probably containing all their worldly possessions. The boys flanked their sisters protectively, and Samuel noticed that 10-year-old Jacob's hands were clenched into small fists. "Jacob," Samuel said suddenly, causing the boy to startle, "would you help me slice this bread? These old hands aren't as steady as they used to be." It was a lie. Samuel's hands were perfectly steady, but Jacob needed something to do besides sit in fear. The boy looked to Emma for permission, received a slight nod, and approached the counter warily. Like this, Samuel demonstrated, his large hands guiding Jacob's smaller ones, slow and even. "There's no rush." As they worked together, Samuel felt some of the tension leave the boy's shoulders. "You're good at this. Do you help with cooking at home?" He caught himself before finishing the question, but the damage was done. Jacob's face closed off. "We don't have a home anymore." The simple statement, delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone by a 10-year-old child, hit Samuel harder than any angry outburst would have. He set down the knife and looked directly at Jacob. "Everyone has a home somewhere," Samuel said quietly. "Sometimes it just takes time to find it." As they prepared the simple meal together, the children began to relax incrementally. Luke, the 8-year-old, started asking questions about the oil lamps. "Don't you have electricity? And the wood-burning stove? How do you cook without pushing buttons?" Little Mercy remained silent, but Samuel noticed she'd stopped flinching every time he moved. It was Emma who broke the careful peace. "You're going to call the authorities, aren't you?" she asked, as Samuel placed plates of food before them. "Tomorrow morning, you'll call and they'll come get us." Samuel paused, a plate halfway to the table. It was the logical thing to do, the legal thing, the responsible thing. These children were minors without guardians, presumably with caseworkers looking for them. The proper channels existed for exactly this situation. But looking at Emma's face, old beyond her years, resigned to disappointment, Samuel found himself saying, "Let's eat first. We'll worry about tomorrow when it comes." It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a promise to turn them in either. Emma studied his face for a long moment, then nodded and began eating with the controlled desperation of someone who'd learned not to waste food. Samuel watched them eat in relative silence, noting details that tugged at his heart. The way Emma made sure everyone else had enough before taking seconds herself. How Jacob cut his little sister's ham into smaller pieces without being asked. The grateful way Luke said thank you for every small kindness. These weren't wild children or troublemakers. They were a family, bound together by loss and love, and the desperate need to protect each other. "Tell me about your parents," Samuel said gently as they finished eating. Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Why? Because children who love each other the way you four do learned that love somewhere. I'd like to know about the people who taught you. For a moment Samuel thought Emma might refuse to answer. Then little Mercy spoke up for the first time since entering the house. Mama made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. Every Saturday morning, Daddy would pretend to eat Mickey's ears first, and Mama would laugh. The simple memory, delivered with such innocent longing, brought tears to Emma's eyes. Jacob reached over and took Mercy's hand. They were good parents, Emma said, her voice thick. Daddy worked construction, but he was home every night for dinner. Mama taught piano lessons in our living room. She was teaching me to play Chopin before. She couldn't finish. They loved you very much, Samuel observed. I can see it in how you take care of each other. We're all we have left, Jacob said fiercely. That's why we can't go back to foster care. They want to split us up, send us to different families. They said it would be easier for placement if we weren't all together. Samuel felt anger rise in his chest, hot, protective anger, unlike anything he'd experienced in years. Split you up. The social worker said most families can't handle 4 kids at once. Luke explained, his young voice matter-of-fact about something that should have been unthinkable. Especially not Emma, because she's almost 13 and harder to place. But we're family. Mercy burst out, her first show of real emotion. Emma reads to me every night. Jacob helps me tie my shoes. Luke shares his candy with everyone. We can't be apart. Samuel looked at these 4 children who had already lost so much, who were now facing the prospect of losing each other, the only family they had left. Something deep in his chest cracked open, something he'd kept carefully sealed for 50 years. You won't be split up, he heard himself say, not while you're under my roof. The words hung in the air like a promise Samuel wasn't sure he could keep. Emma stared at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. You can't just keep us, she said practically. There are laws, systems. People are probably looking for us right now. She was right, of course. Samuel had no legal authority over these children, no right to harbor runaway foster children, no plan for what came next. But as he looked at their faces, hope warring with learned caution, he realized that sometimes faith required action before understanding, love before logic. There are indeed systems, Samuel agreed, but there are also higher laws, and sometimes, he paused, remembering his own words from earlier that evening, sometimes God sends people to our barns for reasons we don't immediately understand. Before anyone could respond, the sound of horses' hooves on gravel interrupted the moment. Samuel's head snapped toward the window, his stomach dropping. In Amish communities, evening visits usually meant emergencies, serious news, or Samuel. Eli Stoltzfus's voice carried through the night. Samuel, are you awake? I have more news about Sarah. The children tensed immediately, Emma's hand moving to her backpack. Samuel could see them preparing to run, their hard-won trust evaporating in the face of discovery. Stay calm, Samuel whispered urgently. Eli is a friend, but you need to hide until I can explain things properly. Where? Emma whispered back. Samuel's mind raced. His house was small, with few hiding places, and Eli was already climbing the porch steps. The root cellar was too far, the upstairs too obvious, the pantry, he said, pointing to a door beside the kitchen. All of you, quickly and quietly, I'll get rid of him as fast as I can. The children moved with the practiced silence of those who'd learned to hide, grabbing their few possessions and disappearing into the small pantry, just as Eli's knock echoed through the house. Samuel quickly cleared the extra plates from the table, his hands shaking slightly as he shoved evidence of his unexpected guests into cabinets. Samuel, Eli called again. I know you're awake. I can see the lamplight. Samuel opened the door to find his neighbor bouncing with excitement, completely oblivious to the drama he'd just interrupted. Eli, it's late, Samuel began, but his friend pushed past him into the kitchen. This couldn't wait. I just came from Miller's store. They had another message from Sarah. She's not coming Thursday after all. Samuel's heart lurched, though whether from disappointment or relief, he couldn't tell. What? Her bus was delayed, then cancelled entirely. Something about weather in Ohio, but here's the wonderful part. She's hired a driver instead. She'll be here tomorrow afternoon, a full 3 days early. Can you believe it? After 4 years of waiting, she'll be home tomorrow. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. Tomorrow. Sarah was coming tomorrow. He glanced involuntarily toward the pantry door, behind which 4 children were hiding, depending on him for protection. Tomorrow, Samuel repeated numbly. I know it's sudden, but think of it as God's blessing. 3 extra days to settle in before the autumn harvest begins. 3 extra days to Samuel. Are you feeling well? You look pale. Samuel forced a smile. Just surprised. It's been a long day. Of course. You'll want to rest up for tomorrow. Oh, Eli snapped his fingers. Rebecca wanted me to ask if you need help preparing anything. Extra cleaning, cooking, that sort of thing. She knows how bachelors live. He chuckled at his own joke. No, thank you. Everything is ready. Eli studied Samuel's face with the shrewd eyes of a lifelong friend. Are you certain you're well? You seem distracted, just overwhelmed. Samuel managed. 4 years is a long time to wait. Indeed it is. Well, I'll leave you to your rest. Big day tomorrow. Eli headed for the door, then paused. Samuel, I'm happy for you, truly. You've waited faithfully, and now you'll be rewarded. It's a good example for all of us. After Eli left, Samuel stood motionless in his kitchen for a long moment, the weight of impossible circumstances pressing down on him. Sarah was coming tomorrow. 4 orphaned children were hiding in his pantry. In less than 24 hours, his carefully ordered life was going to collide with realities he'd never imagined. Is he gone? Emma's whisper came from behind the pantry door. Yes, Samuel said, and the children emerged like shadows, reading his expression with the acute perception of those who'd learned to gauge adult moods for survival. Bad news? Jacob asked quietly. Samuel looked at them, 4 souls who'd trusted him with their safety, who were depending on him for protection they had no right to expect, and he had no authority to provide. Tomorrow Sarah Miller would arrive to begin the life they'd planned for 4 years. Tomorrow the practical, sensible path he'd waited so patiently to resume would finally open before him. But tonight, 4 children needed him in ways Sarah never had. Tonight, he was the only thing standing between them and a system that would tear apart the only family they had left. Not bad news, Samuel said finally. Complicated news, but we'll figure it out together. As he helped the children settle for the night, Emma and Mercy in his sister's old room, the boys on makeshift beds in the living room, Samuel found himself praying harder than he had in years. Not for guidance exactly, but for strength, for wisdom, for the courage to follow a path he couldn't yet see clearly, but felt called to walk nonetheless. Outside, the Pennsylvania countryside slept peacefully under a canopy of stars. Inside Samuel's small house, 5 souls who'd found each other in the most unexpected ways settled into an uneasy rest, unaware that the morning would bring choices that would change all their lives forever. In just a few hours, Sarah Miller would step off a bus and back into Samuel's life. But first he had to decide what kind of man he was going to be when she arrived. The patient, practical suitor who'd waited 4 years for his intended bride, or something else entirely. Something that scared him as much as it called to him. Something that felt suspiciously like the father he'd never thought he'd become. Samuel woke before dawn, as was his custom. But today the familiar ritual felt different. Instead of rising to solitude and planned productivity, he found himself listening to the soft sounds of sleeping children throughout his house. Jacob's gentle snoring from the living room, the whispered murmur of little Mercy talking in her sleep, the creak of floorboards as Emma, ever the protective sister, padded quietly to check on her siblings. He dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, his movements automatic after 50 years of the same routine. but his mind was anything but routine. Sarah would arrive this afternoon. The community expected him to welcome her as his intended bride, to resume the courtship that had been interrupted 4 years ago. But between him and that expectation sat 4 children who had changed everything simply by existing. Samuel made his way to the kitchen, lighting the oil lamp with practiced efficiency. As golden light filled the modest room, he discovered he wasn't alone. Emma sat at his table, fully dressed despite the early hour, her small backpack beside her chair and her siblings' few possessions neatly stacked nearby. "You're leaving," Samuel observed, recognizing the signs. Emma lifted her chin with the same benign bravery she'd shown the night before. "We heard your friend talking about someone coming today. Someone important. We won't cause problems for you." Samuel studied her face, 12 years old, but carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. Her dark hair was neatly braided, her clothes straightened as much as possible. Even preparing to flee, she maintained the dignity their parents had taught her. "Where will you go? We'll figure it out. We always do." The words were brave, but Samuel caught the tremor in her voice. Samuel poured himself coffee from the pot he'd prepared, then sat across from Emma, at the table that had seemed too large for one person, and now felt perfectly sized. "Tell me about the Hendersons, the foster family you ran from." Emma's composure cracked slightly. "I don't want to talk about them. You don't have to tell me everything, but I need to understand what we're dealing with." "We?" Emma's eyes sharpened. "There's no we. You've been kind, but you have your own life. Someone's coming today who matters to you. We heard your friend. He was excited for you. We won't ruin that." Samuel took a sip of his coffee, considering his words carefully. "What if I told you that sometimes God changes our plans? That sometimes what we think we want isn't what we actually need?" "I'd say you're being nice but not realistic." Emma's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd learned not to trust adult promises. People say lots of things when they feel sorry for kids, but when it comes down to choosing between their real life and helping strangers, they always choose their real life. And they should. We're not their responsibility. The mature reasoning delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone by a child broke Samuel's heart. "Who taught you to think like that?" "Life," Emma said simply. "Our social worker means well, but she has 67 cases. The Hendersons took us in for the monthly payments, not because they wanted children. The church people who helped us last week were kind for an afternoon, but they had their own families to worry about. Everyone has limits, Mr. Yoder. We've learned not to expect more than people can give." Samuel set down his coffee cup, decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. "What if I don't have limits? What if God sent you here not as a burden I to bear, but as a blessing I've been waiting for without knowing it?" Emma stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "You don't know us. You don't know what we're like when we're not running scared. Jacob gets nightmares and wakes up screaming. Luke wets the bed sometimes because he's afraid to get up in the dark. Mercy barely talks anymore, except to us. I'm behind in school and I don't trust adults. And I have to take care of everyone all the time. We're not easy children, Mr. Yoder. We're broken." "No," Samuel said firmly, surprising himself with the intensity in his voice. "You're not broken. You're a family who's been through terrible things and is trying to stay together. That's not broken. That's beautiful." Before Emma could respond, footsteps sounded from the living room. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled and his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them. "Emma, are we leaving now?" His voice carried the resigned acceptance of a 10-year-old who'd learned that leaving was often the safest option. "We're discussing it," Samuel said before Emma could answer. "Jacob, are you hungry?" The boy nodded hesitantly. "Good. Then let's wake your brother and sister and have breakfast together, all of us. As a family." The word hung in the air like a promise and a challenge. Emma's eyes widened, and Jacob looked between them with confusion. "But the lady who's coming," Emma began. "Can wait," Samuel finished. Some conversations are more important than others, and this is one of them. As they woke Luke and Mercy and gathered around the table for breakfast, Samuel found himself seeing his home through new eyes. The kitchen he'd always found adequate now seemed warm and welcoming, with 5 people sharing it. The silence he'd grown accustomed to was replaced by the gentle chatter of children discussing their dreams. Luke wanted to learn to build things like his father. Mercy missed her mother's piano lessons. Jacob wondered if Amish farms had dogs. "We had a dog," Mercy said suddenly, speaking more in 10 minutes than she had the entire previous evening. "His name was Buttons, because he had white spots that looked like buttons. After Mama and Daddy died, we couldn't keep him. The lady said the Hendersons didn't allow pets." Samuel felt another piece of his heart break. "What happened to Buttons?" "The neighbor took him," Emma said softly. "She promised to take good care of him, but we never got to say goodbye properly." Samuel made a mental note. If these children stayed, they would have a dog. Every child should have a dog, especially children who'd lost so much. "Mr. Yoder," Luke said, interrupting Samuel's thoughts, "are you really Amish, like in the movies?" Samuel chuckled. "I suspect I'm more ordinary than movie Amish people. We don't all drive buggies dramatically through cornfields, or have mysterious secrets. But you don't have electricity or cars or anything?" Jacob asked with the curious fascination of a 10-year-old. "We choose to live more simply, yes. We believe technology should serve us, not control us. But we're not completely isolated from the modern world. We use phones when necessary, ride in cars when we need to travel long distances. We just try to keep what matters most at the center of our lives." "What matters most?" Mercy asked, her small voice genuinely curious. Samuel looked around the table at 4 faces hanging on his answer. "Family, faith, community, taking care of each other, making sure no one faces life alone." Emma's eyes filled with tears she quickly wiped away. "That's what our mama used to say. She said family wasn't just blood. It was anyone who chose to love you and stick by you no matter what." "Your mama was a wise woman," Samuel said gently. The sound of a car engine approaching interrupted the moment. Samuel's stomach tightened. It was barely 8 in the morning, too early for social calls in his community. He moved to the kitchen window and peered out to see an unfamiliar sedan pulling into his drive. "Stay calm," Samuel told the children, recognizing their immediate tension. "Let me see who this is." Through the window, Samuel watched a middle-aged woman in a business suit emerge from the car, followed by a uniformed police officer. His heart sank. Somehow they'd been found. "Mr. Yoder," Emma's whisper was tight with fear. Samuel turned back to the table, where 4 children sat frozen, their faces reflecting the terror of prey animals sensing predators. "Emma, take your siblings upstairs, quietly. Stay there until I call for you." "They found us, didn't they?" Jacob asked, his young voice breaking. Samuel knelt beside the boy's chair, bringing himself to eye level. "I don't know yet, but I promise you this. Whatever happens, I won't let them split you up. Do you trust me?" 4 sets of eyes studied his face, searching for the lie that would betray them, the weakness that would abandon them. Samuel held their gaze steadily, letting them see the truth he was only just discovering himself, that he would fight for them, that he would protect them, that somewhere in the past 12 hours he had become something he'd never been before. A father. "Yes," Emma said finally, speaking for all of them. "We trust you." As the children disappeared upstairs, Samuel straightened his shoulders and prepared to face whatever came next. Through the window, he could see the woman consulting a clipboard while the officer waited by the car. They were clearly official, clearly here on business, clearly disrupting a life Samuel was only beginning to understand he wanted. The knock on his door was firm and professional. "Mr. Yoder, I'm Janet Morrison from Children's Services. This is Officer Patterson. We have reason to believe you may have information about 4 missing children." Samuel opened the door but didn't invite them in. "Missing children?" "Emma, Jacob, Luke and Mercy Richardson. They disappeared 3 days ago from their foster placement. We've been tracking their movements, and several witnesses reported seeing children matching their description in this area. Samuel studied the woman's face, noting the tired eyes and the stack of files in her car. Another overworked social worker, trying to do an impossible job, with insufficient resources. What happened at their foster placement? Samuel asked. Mrs. Morrison's expression tightened. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics, but I can tell you the children were not in any immediate danger. They simply left without permission. Children don't run away from safe places, Samuel observed quietly. Mr. Yoder, if you have any information about these children, I need you to share it. They're minors without guardians, and they've been missing for 3 days. We're concerned for their safety. From upstairs, a floorboard creaked, just slightly, but enough to make Officer Patterson's head turn toward the sound. Are you alone in the house, sir? The officer asked. Samuel looked between the two officials standing on his porch, knowing that his next words would change everything. He thought about Sarah, arriving in just a few hours to resume a life they'd planned for 4 years. He thought about his community's expectations, about the practical considerations, about the legal complications that would follow any choice he made. Then he thought about 4 children who'd lost everything but each other, who'd found their way to his barn in their darkest hour, who'd trusted him with their safety and their secrets. No, Samuel said clearly, I'm not alone. Miss Morrison's eyebrows. Sir, if you're harboring runaway minors, you could face serious legal consequences. I'm not harboring anyone, Samuel replied. I'm protecting a family. He stepped back and called up the stairs. Emma, bring your siblings down. It's time to face this together. As 4 sets of footsteps slowly descended his stairs, Samuel sent up a prayer for wisdom, for strength, and for the courage to become the man these children needed him to be, even if it meant sacrificing the man he'd planned to become. The morning that was supposed to mark the beginning of his long-awaited reunion with Sarah had instead become the moment when Samuel Yoder chose to fight for a family he'd never expected to claim. The silence in Samuel's living room was deafening as 4 children stood clustered behind his chair, facing the 2 officials who represented everything they feared most. Miss Morrison's clipboard seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in her hands, and Officer Patterson's presence filled the modest room with an authority that made even Samuel feel small. Emma Richardson, Miss Morrison said, her voice attempting warmth but achieving only professional efficiency. We've been very worried about you and your siblings. Are you hurt? Has anyone harmed you? Emma lifted her chin with that familiar defiance, but Samuel noticed her hand trembling as she reached for Mercy's shoulder. We're fine. You've been missing for 3 days. You had no food, no shelter, no adult supervision. That's not fine, Emma. We had each other, Jacob said suddenly, his young voice fierce with protective love. We take care of each other. Miss Morrison's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. I know you do, Jacob. You've all been very brave. But children shouldn't have to take care of each other alone. That's what adults are for. Adults like the Hendersons. Emma's voice cracked like a whip, and Samuel saw Miss Morrison flinch. The situation with the Henderson family has been addressed, Morrison said carefully. Mr. Henderson is no longer approved for foster placement, but that doesn't change the fact that you children need proper care and supervision. What kind of addressing? Samuel asked, his voice carrying an edge that surprised everyone in the room. Miss Morrison looked uncomfortable. I can't discuss specifics due to confidentiality. These children trusted you with their safety, Samuel interrupted, standing to his full height. They were placed in a home where they were clearly mistreated badly enough to risk everything by running away. Now you want to take them back into the same system that failed them. I think they deserve to know what kind of addressing was done. Officer Patterson stepped forward. Sir, I understand your concern, but these children are wards of the state. Morrison has legal custody, and they need to come with us. To go where? Samuel pressed. Back to foster care. Split up into different families because it's more convenient for placement. How do you know about Miss Morrison began, then stopped herself. Because they told me, because they trust me. because in 12 hours they've felt safer here than they did in 3 months with your approved placement. Miss Morrison consulted her clipboard, clearly struggling with a situation that didn't fit her usual protocols. Miss Yoder, I appreciate your concern for these children, but you're not a licensed foster parent. You haven't been background checked, home inspected, or approved for placement. I can't just leave 4 children with a stranger. I'm not a stranger to them anymore, Samuel said quietly. And they're not strangers to me. You've known them for less than a day. Sometimes a day is enough. Samuel moved to stand directly in front of the children, his body forming a barrier between them and the officials. Sometimes God makes his will known in ways we don't expect. Miss Morrison sighed deeply, the weight of an impossible job showing in her tired eyes. Mr. Yoder, I can see that you care about these children, but caring isn't enough. There are procedures, laws, safeguards designed to protect minors. I can't what? Samuel interrupted. Can't leave children with someone who actually wants them. Can't allow a family to stay together. Can't consider that maybe, just maybe, these children know what they need better than your paperwork does. It's that simple. It's exactly that simple. Samuel's voice rose, surprising everyone, including himself. 4 children who've lost everything found their way to my barn. They're fed, they're safe, they're together, and they're loved. How is that not simple? Behind him, Samuel heard Mercy begin to cry, soft, heartbroken sobs that cut through him like knife blades. He turned to see Emma trying to comfort her little sister while fighting her own tears. Please don't make us go back, Mercy whispered, her small voice barely audible. Please don't split us up. We'll be good. We promise we'll be good. The words hit everyone in the room like physical blows. Officer Patterson shifted uncomfortably, and Samuel saw something crack in Miss Morrison's professional composure. Sweetheart, Morrison said, her voice gentler now, no one thinks you haven't been good. This isn't about being good or bad. This is about making sure you're safe and cared for properly. We are safe here, Luke said, stepping forward with 8-year-old conviction. Yoder made us breakfast and helped Jacob cut bread, and he didn't yell at anybody, and he said we're a family. A family, Miss Morrison repeated, looking at Samuel with new assessment. Mr. Yoder, are you married? Do you have children of your own? The question hit Samuel like a punch to the chest. No, I don't. Then you don't understand the complexities of child rearing, the legal responsibilities, the financial obligations. I understand love, Samuel said simply. I understand that these 4 children have been through more trauma in 3 months than most people face in a lifetime, and they're still taking care of each other. I understand that they're terrified of being separated, and I understand that sometimes God calls us to do things that don't make sense on paper, but make perfect sense in our hearts. Miss Morrison studied him for a long moment. Yoder, even if I wanted to consider alternative placement, which would be highly irregular, you're a single man with no experience raising children. The state requires a knock on the door, interrupted her words, followed by a familiar voice calling out, Samuel, it's Sarah, I'm here. Samuel's blood turned to ice. Through the window he could see a taxi idling in his driveway, luggage stacked beside the porch. Sarah Miller stood at his door, radiant with the joy of reunion after 4 years of separation, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding inside. The children looked at Samuel with confused terror. Miss Morrison raised her eyebrows. Officer Patterson's hand moved unconsciously toward his radio. Samuel, Sarah called again, then opened the door and stepped inside without waiting for permission. The privilege of someone who considered herself practically family already. Sarah Miller was exactly as Samuel remembered her. Tall, slender, with serious brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a dark blue dress and carried herself with the quiet dignity of an Amish woman who'd spent 4 years caring for an invalid parent. Her face glowed with anticipation as she stepped into the living room, then froze as she took in the scene before her. Samuel, who are these people? Samuel felt the weight of impossible circumstances crushing down on him. The woman he'd waited 4 years for stood in his doorway, finally ready to begin the life they'd planned. Government officials were preparing to take away 4 children who desperately needed protection, and he had to choose right now what kind of man he was going to be. "Sarah," Samuel said, his voice surprisingly steady. "These are Emma, Jacob, Luke, and Mercy Richardson, and this is Ms. Morrison from Children's Services and Officer Patterson." Sarah's confusion was evident as she looked between the children huddled behind Samuel and the official-looking adults facing them. "Children's Services, Samuel, what's happening here?" "These children needed help," Samuel said simply. "I gave it to them, but you knew I was coming today. We have so much to discuss, so many plans to make." "The plans have changed, Sarah." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah's face went pale, Ms. Morrison looked startled, and the children pressed closer to Samuel as if sensing that something momentous was shifting. "Changed how?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel looked at the woman he'd waited for faithfully for 4 years, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Sarah was a good woman, devout, practical, reliable. She would make someone an excellent wife. But as he studied her face, he realized with startling clarity that the love he felt for her was the comfortable affection of friendship, not the deep, consuming love of a true marriage. "I can't marry you, Sarah," Samuel said gently. "I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I know how that sounds after everything we've planned, after all your waiting, but I can't be the husband you deserve while my heart is called elsewhere." "Elsewhere?" Sarah's voice broke slightly. "Samuel, you're not making sense. These are strangers' children. Our life together would be built on duty rather than love," Samuel finished. "You deserve better than that. You deserve a man who chooses you first, always, without hesitation." "That's not who I am, Sarah. Not anymore." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but Samuel saw something else there too. Relief, perhaps. As if she too had harbored doubts about their arranged future, but hadn't known how to voice them. "4 years, Sarah whispered. 4 years I've been planning to come home to you. I know, and I'm sorrier than I can say. But Sarah, look at me truly. When you imagined our life together, were you excited or resigned? Were you eager or dutiful?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. Miss Morrison cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the personal drama, but determined to stay focused on her mission. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that these children need proper placement. Yoder, even if you're serious about wanting to care for them, you're now an unmarried man with no support system, no experience, and no legal standing. I have to take them back into state custody." "No." The word came out of Samuel with such finality that everyone in the room startled. "You're not taking them anywhere." "Sir, I have the legal authority." "Then arrest me," Samuel said simply, "because I won't let you split up this family." Officer Patterson stepped forward reluctantly. "Mr. Yoder, it doesn't have to come to that. Be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. These children have been failed by every adult authority in their lives. They've been placed with people who harmed them, then had their concerns dismissed when they tried to get help. Now you want to drag them back into the same system that created this mess in the first place. That's not reasonable. That's criminal." "Samuel," Sarah said quietly, and something in her tone made everyone turn toward her. She was studying the 4 children with new eyes, taking in their protective huddle, their obvious terror, the way they looked at Samuel with desperate trust. "How old are you?" Sarah asked. "Emma," gently. 12. Emma replied warily. "And you've been taking care of your siblings since your parents died?" Emma nodded. "That's a heavy burden for someone so young." "It's not a burden," Emma said fiercely. "They're my family." Sarah looked at each child in turn, then at Samuel, then at the government officials preparing to tear a family apart. Something shifted in her expression, a resolution forming that surprised everyone, including herself. "Miss Morrison," Sarah said, stepping forward with newfound authority, "what would it take to allow Mr. Yoder to become their legal guardian?" Samuel began, but she held up a hand to stop him. Answer the question, please. Miss Morrison looked flustered. Well, there would need to be home studies, background checks, financial verification, character references, training classes. The process takes months, sometimes years. But it's possible. Theoretically, yes. But and during that process, where would the children live? In temporary foster care, probably separated, due to the difficulty of finding a single placement for 4. What if they had a suitable temporary placement? Someone who could provide proper supervision while Mr. Yoder completed the requirements. Samuel stared at Sarah, beginning to understand what she was suggesting. Sarah, no, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, Sarah said firmly. I'm offering. Miss Morrison, would a married couple be more suitable as temporary guardians? The room fell into stunned silence. Morrison's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Officer Patterson looked confused. The children stared between Samuel and Sarah with growing hope and disbelief. You want to marry him anyway? Miss Morrison asked. Even knowing he wants to adopt 4 children you've just met. Sarah looked at Samuel for a long moment, and he saw her making her own calculations, her own leap of faith. I want to save a family, Sarah said quietly. And maybe, in the process, create the family I've always wanted, but never knew how to ask for. The silence that followed Sarah's declaration stretched like a held breath. Samuel stared at the woman he'd known for years, but was seeing clearly for the first time, not as the practical arrangement they'd both settled for, but as someone capable of extraordinary compassion when it mattered most. Sarah, Samuel said softly, you don't understand what you're offering. These children have been through trauma. They have nightmares, fears, behavioral issues. This isn't the quiet, orderly life we planned. No, Sarah agreed, her eyes moving to each child's face. It's not. It's something better. Emma stepped forward, her protective instincts overriding her confusion. Ma'am, you don't have to do this for us. We know we're a lot to handle. We don't want to ruin your life too. Sarah knelt down to Emma's eye level, her movements gentle but deliberate. Sweetheart, what's your favorite thing about your family? Emma blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What do you mean? Your siblings. What do you love most about being their big sister? Emma glanced back at Jacob, Luke and Mercy, her expression softening. I love how Jacob always shares his favorite things, even when he doesn't have much. And Luke makes everyone laugh when they're sad. And Mercy, she gives the best hugs in the world, and she remembers everything that makes people happy. And they love you the same way? Yes, ma'am. Sarah stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with each word. Emma, I lost my own mother 3 months ago. Before that, I spent 4 years taking care of her while she was sick. I know what it feels like to be responsible for someone you love more than yourself. I know what it feels like to be afraid of losing the only family you have left. Tears spilled down Emma's cheeks. But we're not your family. We're just your 4 children who need parents. Sarah interrupted gently. And I'm a woman who spent 4 years learning how to take care of people who need me. Maybe God has been preparing all of us for this moment longer than any of us realized. Miss Morrison cleared her throat, clearly struggling to maintain professional composure in the face of such raw emotion. Mrs. Miller, I appreciate the sentiment, but this is highly irregular. You can't just decide to marry someone and adopt 4 children in one afternoon. There are procedures, waiting periods. How long for a marriage license in Pennsylvania? Samuel asked suddenly. Miss Morrison looked startled. I don't know. That's not my department. Officer Patterson pulled out his phone. 3 days waiting period, unless you can prove hardship circumstances to a judge. And what constitutes hardship circumstances? Sarah asked. Well, imminent separation of family members due to legal proceedings would probably qualify. Samuel and Sarah looked at each other, an understanding passing between them that transcended their years of careful courtship. This wasn't the romantic love story either of them had imagined, but it was something rarer, a conscious choice to build something meaningful together. Ms. Morrison, Samuel said, his voice gaining strength with each word. I want to formally request emergency temporary custody of these 4 children, with Mrs. Miller as my co-guardian. We'll marry as soon as legally possible and begin whatever procedures are necessary for permanent adoption. Mr. Yoder, you can't just. Why not? Sarah asked, pointedly. These children have been failed by the system repeatedly. They've found safety and stability here. Rather than traumatizing them further by forcing another separation, why not allow them to stay in a safe environment while the proper paperwork is completed? Ms. Morrison looked overwhelmed. There would have to be immediate home inspections, emergency background checks, financial verification. Then do them, Samuel said simply. Today, tomorrow, whenever you need to. We have nothing to hide. And if you fail any of the requirements. Samuel felt 4 pairs of eyes watching him, waiting for his answer to the question that would determine their entire future. He thought about his quiet, orderly life, about the plans he'd made for a simple marriage and peaceful golden years. Then he looked at Emma's tear-streaked face, at Jacob's protective stance, at Luke's hopeful eyes, at little Mercy who had finally found someone willing to fight for her. We won't fail, Samuel said with quiet conviction. We can't afford to. Morrison consulted her clipboard, then looked at Officer Patterson, who shrugged, as if to say this was beyond his expertise. Finally, she turned back to Samuel and Sarah. This is the most irregular situation I've encountered in 15 years of social work, she said, but these children have been through enough trauma. If you're serious about this, truly serious, I can make some calls. The emergency custody process could potentially be expedited if all parties agree and initial safety requirements are met. What kind of safety requirements? Sarah asked. Home inspection, background checks, character references, proof of financial stability, emergency medical authorization. It's a long list. How long do we have? If I can get approval from my supervisor, maybe 72 hours to complete the immediate requirements, but that's assuming everything goes perfectly, which it never does. Samuel looked at Sarah, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. We'll manage it. Samuel, Ms. Morrison said seriously, you need to understand what you're taking on. These aren't just 4 children. They're 4 traumatized children who will need therapy, special attention, potentially years of healing. Emma will need to be enrolled in school immediately. The boys will need male role models and activities. Mercy hasn't spoken to anyone outside the family in months. They'll test your patience, challenge your authority, and push every boundary you set because they're terrified of being abandoned again. Good, Sarah said firmly, surprising everyone. That means they're survivors. That means they're fighters. That means they won't give up easily, and neither will we. Miss Morrison stared at her for a long moment, then made a decision that would change 5 lives forever. Officer Patterson, please radio in that we've located the Richardson children, and they're safe. I need to make some calls. As Miss Morrison stepped outside to contact her supervisor, the living room fell into an awkward silence. Sarah looked at the 4 children who might soon become her responsibility, while they stared back at this stranger who had just offered to completely upend her life for them. Mrs. Miller, Emma said hesitantly, why are you doing this? You don't even know us. Sarah sat down on Samuel's couch, gesturing for the children to join her. After a moment's hesitation, they did, Emma perching on the edge ready to flee, the boys flanking their sisters protectively. Mercy curled against Emma's side. Do you want the honest answer? Sarah asked. Emma nodded. When I was taking care of my mother, I used to dream about having a house full of children. Laughter at breakfast, homework spread across the kitchen table, bedtime stories, and Christmas morning chaos. But I never married young, and then my mother got sick, and the years just passed. I convinced myself I was content with the quiet life, Samuel, and I had planned. She paused, looking at each child in turn. But watching you 4 together, seeing how you protect each other and love each other despite everything you've been through. I realize that family isn't about blood or perfect circumstances or careful planning. It's about choosing to love someone and then fighting to keep that love safe, even when it's hard. Luke asked in a small voice. Especially when it's hard, Sarah said with a smile. The best families are forged in difficulty, not in ease. But what if we're too broken? Mercy whispered, speaking directly to Sarah for the first time. Sarah reached out slowly, giving Mercy time to pull away, then gently tucked a strand of hair behind the little girl's ear. Sweetheart, broken things can be mended, and sometimes they're stronger in the mended places than they ever were before. Samuel watched this exchange with wonder, seeing Sarah transform from the reserved woman he'd known into someone radiant with maternal purpose. Maybe this wasn't the love story either of them had expected, but watching her with these children, he felt something stirring in his chest that had nothing to do with duty or practicality, and everything to do with the kind of love that changes everything. Morrison returned, her expression cautiously optimistic. I spoke with my supervisor and the family court judge. Given the extraordinary circumstances and the children's clear preference to remain together, they've agreed to expedited emergency custody proceedings. If you can meet the basic requirements within 72 hours, temporary custody will be granted, pending completion of the full adoption process. What exactly do we need to do? Samuel asked. Miss Morrison pulled out a fresh form. Background checks for both of you. I can expedite those. Home safety inspection. I can do that myself this afternoon. 3 character references each. Proof of financial stability. Marriage license application. Basic child safety training. There's an emergency course offered Saturday mornings. Medical authorizations and insurance coverage. And both of you need to sign affidavits stating your commitment to keeping the siblings together regardless of any future legal complications. Samuel looked at the list, calculating the logistics. It was daunting but not impossible. There's one more thing, Ms. Morrison continued. The children need to be formally interviewed to confirm this is their choice. They need to understand that once this process begins, there's no going back. They'll be your legal responsibility until they reach adulthood. We understand, Emma said firmly. We want to stay together, and we want to stay here. Jacob, Luke, Mercy, do you all agree? 3 small voices said yes, with conviction that made Samuel's chest tighten with emotion. Then let's begin, Morrison said, pulling out her phone to make the first of many calls that would need to be completed in the next 3 days. As the afternoon unfolded in a whirlwind of phone calls, forms and official visits, Samuel found himself marveling at how quickly life could change. This morning he'd been a bachelor, waiting for his intended bride. Tonight he was part of a family of 6, preparing to battle bureaucracy for the right to love unconditionally. Sarah proved to be a force of nature when motivated, efficiently organizing appointments, gathering documents, and somehow managing to keep 4 anxious children fed and calm throughout the chaos. Samuel watched her natural maternal instincts emerge and realized that she hadn't just been waiting 4 years for him. She'd been waiting for the family she'd always been meant to have. As evening fell and the children settled into their temporary bedrooms, Samuel and Sarah found themselves alone in the kitchen, surrounded by forms and phone numbers, and the debris of a day that had changed everything. Are we completely insane? Sarah asked, pouring coffee for both of them. Probably, Samuel admitted. Will that worry you? Sarah considered the question seriously. No. What worries me is the thought of failing them. What worries me is not being enough when they need us to be everything. Samuel reached across the table and took her hand, the first truly intimate gesture they'd shared in all their years of courtship. We'll be enough, he said quietly. Not because we're perfect, but because we're committed, because we choose them, and we choose each other, and we choose to do whatever it takes. Sarah squeezed his hand, and in that simple gesture, Samuel felt the foundation of something real and lasting, not the practical arrangement they'd planned, but a partnership forged in purpose and sealed with love. Outside, Pennsylvania slumbered under a canopy of stars. Inside Samuel's house, 6 souls who'd found each other in the most unexpected ways, prepared for a future none of them could have imagined, but all of them had somehow been waiting for their entire lives. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more paperwork, more tests of their commitment. But tonight, for the first time in months, 4 children went to sleep, knowing they were safe, they were together, and they were wanted. And for the first time in his life, Samuel Yoder fell asleep, knowing that his house was finally truly home. The next morning brought chaos that Samuel had never experienced in his 50 years of orderly living. He woke to the sound of children's voices drifting up from the kitchen, not the quiet murmur of polite conversation, but the genuine chatter of a family coming to life. Emma was explaining to Mercy why they needed to eat everything on their plates, because Mr. Samuel and Miss Sarah are working so hard for us, while Jacob peppered Sarah with questions about Amish life. Do you really milk cows by hand? And Luke announced his intention to learn carpentry so he could help Samuel build furniture. Samuel dressed quickly and made his way downstairs to find Sarah orchestrating breakfast with the efficiency of a seasoned general. She'd somehow managed to locate his mother's old aprons and wore one over her simple blue dress, her hair slightly mussed from working in the unfamiliar kitchen. The sight of her moving confidently through his space, making it warm and welcoming in ways he'd never imagined, struck him with unexpected force. "Good morning," Sarah said, glancing up from the stove where she was flipping pancakes. "I hope you don't mind. I found ingredients for a proper breakfast. The children need substantial food if they're going to handle today's appointment." Samuel surveyed the scene, his kitchen table surrounded by 4 children eating enthusiastically, while Sarah bustled between stove and counter, coffee percolating, morning light streaming through windows that somehow seemed brighter than usual. "I don't mind," he said, and meant it completely. Emma looked up from cutting Mercy's pancakes into bite-sized pieces. "Mr. Samuel, Miss Sarah says we're going to town today to do important paperwork. Will people stare at her?" It was a question that revealed how much these children had learned to expect unwanted attention, suspicious looks, whispered conversations about those poor orphans. Samuel sat down at the table, noting how naturally the children made room for him. "Some might," he said honestly. "People in small towns notice strangers. But Emma, you need to understand something. You're not visitors passing through anymore. You're becoming part of this community. These people will be your neighbors, your teachers, your friends. They'll care about you because you belong here now." "Do we really belong?" Luke asked, his 8-year-old voice carrying more weight than it should have needed to. "You belong here as much as I do," Samuel said firmly. "More, maybe. This house has been waiting for you longer than I've been waiting for you." Sarah set a plate of akeks in front of Samuel, her hand briefly touching his shoulder, a gesture so natural and intimate that it surprised them both. "The first appointment is at 9, she said. "Ms. Morrison wants to complete the home inspection while the children are present, so she can observe family interactions in a natural setting." "What kind of interactions?" Jacob asked suspiciously. "The kind you were just having," Sarah smiled. "Talking, helping each other, being yourselves. She needs to see that this feels like a real family, not just adults trying to rescue children out of pity." "Is that what you're doing?" Emma's question was direct, challenging. "Rescuing us out of pity?" Samuel set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "Emma, do you remember yesterday morning when you were ready to leave because you thought we were being kind out of obligation?" Emma nodded. "What changed your mind?" Emma thought for a moment. "You got angry when that lady wanted to split us up? Really angry, like it hurt you to think about? People don't get that angry about strangers." "Exactly. And that's what Miss Morrison needs to see, that somewhere between finding you in my barn and fighting for you in my living room, you stopped being strangers and started being family." At 9 o'clock precisely, Ms. Morrison arrived with 2 additional social workers and a clipboard thick enough to serve as a weapon. Samuel had expected intrusion, but the reality was more invasive than he'd prepared for. They measured rooms, tested smoke detectors, examined the contents of his refrigerator, and questioned every aspect of his household management with the thoroughness of investigators. Mr. Yoder, one of the additional workers, said, "Your home is quite small for a family of 6. Where exactly will everyone sleep?" Samuel had anticipated this question. "Emma and Mercy will share the larger bedroom upstairs. Jacob and Luke will share the smaller room. Sarah and I will take the downstairs bedroom. And you're comfortable with those arrangements long term? If necessary, we'll add on to the house. But for now, yes, we're comfortable. These children have been sleeping in barns and hiding in abandoned buildings. A shared bedroom with their sibling in a warm, safe house is a luxury, not a hardship." The social worker made notes, clearly skeptical but unable to argue with the logic. Ms. Morrison spent considerable time observing interactions between the adults and children. She watched Sarah help Mercy tie her shoes, noting how the little girl leaned into the touch. She observed Jacob naturally seeking Samuel's approval when he helped carry inspection equipment. She saw Luke unconsciously reaching for Sarah's hand when the strangers made him nervous, and Emma's protective positioning that gradually relaxed as she realized the adults were genuinely supportive. Mrs. Morrison said during a private moment in the kitchen, "Yesterday you'd never met these children. Today you're prepared to commit the rest of your life to raising them. That's a dramatic change of life direction." Sarah paused in washing dishes, considering her answer carefully. "Miss Morrison, do you have children? 2 boys, grown now. Do you remember the moment you first held them? When you realized that this tiny person was completely dependent on you and that you would literally die to protect them?" "Of course. That's what happened to me yesterday. Not with birth, but with choice. I looked at 4 children who had already lost everyone who was supposed to protect them, and I realized that I could either walk away and let the system fail them again, or I could choose to love them completely and immediately. There wasn't really a decision to make." Miss Morrison made more notes, but Samuel caught the slight softening around her eyes. The afternoon brought a parade of appointments, background check, fingerprinting, financial verification at the bank, character references from Eli Stoltzfus, and Samuel's sister Rebecca, who drove in from her neighboring community with enthusiastic endorsements and arms full of children's clothing. "Samuel's been waiting his whole life to be a father," Rebecca told Miss Morrison with characteristic directness. "He just didn't know he was waiting. Look at him with those children. Does that look like a man who's uncertain about his calling?" Through the window, they could see Samuel in the backyard teaching Jacob and Luke to identify different types of wood grain, while Emma and Sarah worked in the small garden, Mercy helping by collecting interesting rocks in her apron pockets. "And Miss Morrison asked Rebecca, "I've known Sarah since she was young. She spent 4 years sacrificing her own happiness to care for an invalid mother with grace and devotion. If she's choosing to build a family with my brother, it's because she sees something worth building. Sarah doesn't make frivolous decisions." By evening, the official whirlwind had passed, leaving behind a house full of exhausted adults and children who'd answered more questions than most adults face in a year. Miss Morrison gathered her papers and files, her expression unreadable. "The preliminary reports look positive," she announced. "Background checks are clean, financial stability is adequate, character references are glowing, and home safety meets all requirements. If you can complete the marriage license process tomorrow and finish the parenting course on Saturday, emergency temporary custody can be granted Sunday afternoon." Emma gripped Samuel's hand. "Really? We can stay?" "Temporarily," Ms. Morrison emphasized. "The full adoption process will take months and require additional evaluations, home studies, and legal proceedings. But yes, if all goes well, you can stay together while that process moves forward." After Morrison left, the house settled into a quiet evening routine that felt both new and ancient. Sarah helped the younger children with baths, while Samuel and Emma worked on a puzzle at the kitchen table. The domesticity of it struck Samuel profoundly. This was what family felt like, not perfect, not without challenges, but complete in a way his solitary life had never been. Samuel, Emma said quietly as they fitted puzzle pieces together. Are you scared? Terrified, Samuel admitted. Are you? Yes, but the good kind of scared, like when you're about to do something really important that might change everything. Samuel looked at this 12-year-old girl who'd been forced to grow up too quickly but had somehow maintained her capacity for hope. Emma, I want you to know something. Even if the legal process fails somehow, even if there are complications we can't foresee, I will never stop fighting for your family. This isn't temporary kindness that will disappear when things get difficult. This is permanent commitment. Tears filled Emma's eyes. Even when Jacob has nightmares and wakes everyone up screaming. Even when Luke gets scared and acts younger than he is. Even when Mercy won't talk to strangers and I get bossy and protective. Especially then, Samuel said firmly. Emma, families aren't defined by perfection. They're defined by choosing to love each other through imperfection. Your parents taught you that. I can see it in how you take care of your siblings. Now you need to let Sarah and me take care of all of you, including you. I don't know how to let adults take care of me anymore, Emma whispered. I've been the grown-up for so long. Samuel reached over and gently took her hands, noting how small they were despite carrying such enormous responsibility. Then we'll learn together. You can teach me how to be a father, and I'll teach you how to be a child again. Deal? Deal, Emma said, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked like the 12-year-old girl she was supposed to be. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Samuel and Sarah sat on the front porch swing, processing the magnitude of what they were undertaking. The Pennsylvania countryside stretched before them, peaceful under a blanket of stars, while inside their house 4 children slept soundly for the second night in a row. Sarah, Samuel said quietly, there's something I need to tell you before we go any further. Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious. When I told you yesterday that I couldn't marry you because my heart was called elsewhere, I thought I meant it was called to these children. But tonight, watching you with them, seeing how naturally you've become their mother, I realized something else. Samuel paused, struggling to find words for feelings he'd never expected to experience. I think my heart was always supposed to find its way to you, but not as the practical arrangement we'd planned, as the woman who would choose love over security, family over simplicity, chaos over comfort, as the woman who would look at 4 broken children and see not problems to be solved but blessings to be treasured. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Samuel, for 4 years I convinced myself I was content with the idea of marriage as a peaceful partnership. But yesterday, when you stood between those children and the people who wanted to separate them, I fell in love with the man you became in that moment. Not the careful, cautious Samuel I'd known, but the Samuel who was willing to fight for what mattered. Samuel reached for her hand, and this time the gesture carried all the tenderness and promise their previous interactions had lacked. So when we marry tomorrow, it won't be the arrangement we planned. No, Sarah said softly. It'll be the love story we never knew we were writing. They sat in comfortable silence, hands joined, hearts finally aligned, while inside their house 4 children dreamed of safety and belonging. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more tests, more bureaucratic hurdles to overcome. But tonight, 6 souls who'd found each other against all odds rested in the knowledge that some families aren't born, they're chosen, they're fought for, and they're sealed with love that transforms everyone it touches. The morning that had started with chaos and uncertainty was ending with the quiet confidence of people who'd discovered their true calling. In less than 48 hours, Samuel's carefully ordered world had been completely upended and rebuilt into something infinitely better, a home filled with laughter and love and the beautiful chaos of family. 6 months later, Samuel stood in his expanded kitchen, now twice its original size, thanks to a community barn raising that had brought together Amish and English neighbors alike, watching the beautiful chaos of Saturday morning breakfast. Sarah moved between stove and table with practiced grace, her belly just beginning to show the curve of the baby they'd been blessed with, after years of believing children weren't in God's plan for them. Emma, now 13 and enrolled in the local school where she was catching up academically at an astonishing rate, helped Mercy practice reading, while simultaneously keeping Luke from feeding his scrambled eggs to the golden retriever puppy they'd rescued from the shelter 3 months ago. "Buttons too isn't hungry, Luke," Emma said patiently, using the name Mercy had insisted on for their new family member. "He has his own breakfast, but he looks sad," Luke protested, his 8-year-old logic unassailable. "He looks hopeful," Jacob corrected, scratching behind the puppy's ears. "There's a difference, right, Dad?" The word still made Samuel's chest tighten with joy. Dad, not Mr. Samuel or Sir, but Dad spoken with the casual confidence of a child who'd never doubted his place in the family, despite the legal battles that had raged for months before the adoption was finalized just 2 weeks ago. "Buttons too has learned that breakfast time means possibility," Samuel agreed, settling into his chair at the head of a table that now seated 8 comfortably. "He's not sad, he's optimistic, like us," Mercy said, looking up from her reading with a smile that lit up her entire face. At nearly 7 now, she'd blossomed into a chatterbox who made friends everywhere she went, though she still reserved her deepest trust for her family. "We're optimistic too. What does optimistic mean again?" Luke asked. "It means believing good things will happen," Emma explained, then paused as she caught Samuel and Sarah sharing one of their looks, the kind of wordless communication that had developed between them as their arranged marriage had transformed into something deeper and truer than either had imagined possible. "Are you having one of your parent moments?" Jacob asked, with the directness of a 10-year-old. "What's a parent moment?" Sarah laughed, settling into her chair and automatically cutting Mercy's toast into triangles, the way the little girl preferred. "When you and Dad look at each other like you're having a whole conversation without words," Emma explained, "usually right before you tell us something important or ask us to help with extra chores." Samuel chuckled, marveling at how perceptive children could be. "Actually, we were thinking about something that happened a year ago today." The children's attention focused on him with the sharp interest they'd learned to apply to family stories. Over the months, they'd begun to treat their origin story, how 4 runaway children had found their way to an Amish man's barn and changed 6 lives forever, as a treasured family legend that grew richer with each retelling. "A year ago, 4 scared children were hiding in my barn, and I was a lonely man waiting for a life that was never quite right for me," Samuel continued. "None of us knew that God was orchestrating something beautiful." "You mean when Mama Sarah decided to marry you anyway, even though you wanted us more than her?" Mercy asked with the blunt honesty of childhood. Sarah laughed, reaching over to tuck a strand of Mercy's hair behind her ear. "I meant when I realized that sometimes the family you're meant to have isn't the one you plan for. It's the one that finds you when you're brave enough to say yes to love. And now we're having a baby," Luke added matter-of-factly. "So the family keeps growing." "Speaking of the baby," Emma said, her expression turning serious in the way that meant she'd been thinking about something important. "Have you decided on names yet?" Samuel and Sarah exchanged another look. Not a parent moment this time, but the shared anticipation of people about to share wonderful news. "We have," Sarah said. "We wanted to talk to all of you about it first, since this baby will be everyone's sibling." "If it's a boy," Samuel said, "we'd like to name him David Michael. David for strength and courage, Michael for protection. David Michael Richardson Yoder." The hyphenated last name had been Sarah's idea, a way to honor the children's birth parents while claiming them fully into their new family. The legal paperwork had been complicated, but the symbolic importance had been worth every bureaucratic hurdle. "And if it's a girl?" Jacob asked. "Hope Elizabeth," Sarah said softly. "Hope because that's what she represents for our family, and Elizabeth because it means God is my oath, a reminder that families built on faith and love are blessed beyond measure." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Hope Elizabeth Richardson Yoder," she repeated. "That's beautiful. Either way," Samuel added, "this baby will grow up knowing they have the best big brothers and sisters in the world, and that they're part of a family that was created by choice, prayer, and the kind of love that changes everything. As if summoned by talk of the future, Eli Stoltzfus's voice called from the front yard. "Samuel, Sarah, are you ready for visitors?" Through the kitchen window they could see not just Eli, but a small parade of buggies and cars, their extended community arriving for the celebration they'd planned to mark the first anniversary of the day that had changed everything. Rebecca and her family, the Millers who'd welcomed Sarah back into their fold with joy, neighbors both Amish and English who'd rallied around the unconventional family with overwhelming support. "Are we ready?" Sarah asked, looking around the table at their children, legally fully permanently theirs now, who were practically vibrating with excitement. "We're ready," Emma said, speaking with the authority of someone who'd learned that being ready didn't mean being perfect. It meant being willing to embrace whatever came next, with love and courage. As they moved outside to greet their guests, Samuel felt a profound sense of completion. A year ago, he'd been a man waiting for a life that would never quite fulfill him. Today, he was a father, husband and pillar of a community that had grown to include families like theirs, built not on blood or tradition alone, but on the radical decision to love without limits. The celebration that followed was everything a family gathering should be: chaotic, joyful, and filled with the kind of laughter that comes from people who've found their place in the world. Children ran between the adults. Samuel's carpentry skills were praised as guests admired the house expansion. Sarah's cooking drew compliments that made her glow with pride, and the 4 Richardson Yoder children held court like young ambassadors, confidently introducing their baby-to-be and explaining their family's unusual but wonderful origin story. As the sun set over the Pennsylvania countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Samuel found himself standing on his front porch, with Sarah watching their children play in the yard with the community kids, who'd become their dearest friends. Emma was teaching a group of younger children a game she'd learned at school. Jacob was helping Eli's grandson build something complicated with sticks and string. Luke was racing around with Buttons too and several other dogs, his laughter carrying on the evening breeze. And Mercy sat in Rebecca's lap, confidently reading aloud from a picture book to an audience of admiring adults. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices that night?" Sarah asked, her hand resting on her growing belly. Samuel considered the question seriously. "I think we would have spent the rest of our lives wondering what we'd missed. The children would have been separated, lost in a system that couldn't see their worth. You and I would have married out of duty and lived quietly, never knowing what real love felt like. And now..." Samuel wrapped his arm around his wife, his true wife, not the arrangement they'd planned, but the love they'd chosen, and pulled her close. "Now we have everything, not the everything we expected, but the everything we needed without knowing we needed it." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, and they stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of family and community and home. Inside the house, the rooms that had once echoed with loneliness now held the accumulated treasures of a growing family. School projects and artwork, covering the refrigerator, toys scattered in corners, books and puzzles, and the wonderful debris of lives being lived fully. "Samuel," Emma called from the yard, "come help us with something." He looked down at Sarah, who smiled and nodded toward their children. "Go," she said. "Your family needs you." Samuel kissed her forehead and headed toward the yard, but paused at the porch steps to look back at the woman who'd surprised him by becoming not just the mother his children needed, but the partner his heart had been seeking without knowing it. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying all the love and gratitude he felt for the path that had brought them to this moment. "Thank you." "For what?" "For saying yes to the impossible, for choosing love over comfort, for becoming the mother they needed, and the woman I never knew I was waiting for." Sarah's smile was radiant in the golden evening light. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the best families are the ones we build with our choices, rather than the ones we inherit with our birth." As Samuel joined his children in the yard, participating in whatever elaborate game they'd devised, he felt the profound contentment of a man whose life had exceeded every dream he'd dared to dream. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, preparing for the baby, supporting the children through the ongoing adjustments of their new life, continuing to build the kind of family that honored both their past and their future. But tonight, under a canopy of Pennsylvania stars, 6 souls who'd found each other in the most unexpected way celebrated the anniversary of the day that had taught them all that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as interruptions to our carefully planned lives. Sometimes the family we're meant to have is the one that finds us when we're brave enough to open our hearts to love, without conditions, without hesitation, and without limits. In the distance, a barn owl called across the fields, the same sound that had accompanied Samuel's lonely evenings for 50 years. But tonight, surrounded by the laughter of his children and the love of his wife, carrying the promise of new life and infinite possibilities, the owl's call didn't sound lonely at all. It sounded like hope.